Hey there, deep divers. It's Julie B, and today I am diving into season 2, episode 3 of Severance. Who is alive? Now, this was a wild one, so we've got a lot to talk about. And toward the end, I'm going to give you a little spoiler warning for the last few minutes where I will address a revelation that happened in episode 4. So stay tuned for that, and without further ado, let's get into it. Let's address the Harmony Cobel situation first. At the start of the episode, she's sitting in her car on the edge of a deserted road in the middle of nowhere, apparently having slept all night in it. In the featurette at the end of episode 2, creator Dan Erickson pointed out that Harmony has been in this system her whole life, and when she's cast out of it, where do you go? Now, this implies what we figured all along as fans, that she's basically been in this cult of Keir since she was a child. Based on the shrine in Harmony's house to Keir in season 1, it was pretty obvious to me that she's a true believer in the cult of Keir. She literally kneels before it, reverently, like she's praying to Keir. There's a picture of a young girl in pigtails at the Myrtle Egan School for Girls, and we can assume this is probably her in the photo. So she's been indoctrinated from a young age, just like Ms. Wong probably has been as well, our new character. Also in that shrine, there is a breathing tube and a hospital bracelet that says Charlotte Cobel with a birth date of 3/17/1944, so it's safe to assume that it belonged to Harmony's mother. I would guess that Harmony was orphaned when her mother died, and she was raised by this Keir cult, probably living at the Egan School for Girls. In the car beside Harmony here, we see that breathing tube again, likely the only thing she has left of her mother. In her distraught state after being rejected by Lumon yet again in episode 2, having been told that Milch has her job and the board won't give it back to her, she seems to be spinning out. So she took this long drive because she's truly lost without her connection to Lumon and the cult of Keir, and she probably felt the need to take this piece of her mother with her to support her. She doesn't seem to have anyone else in her life. Without Lumon, without the cult of Keir, she's unmoored and set adrift. I have to say, this show is so phenomenal that it can even make you sympathize with a cold-hearted villain like Harmony Cobel. Later in the episode, she meets with Helena in the parking lot of Lumon and says if they want her back, it must be on her terms. She doesn't want that busy work job the company made up for her, head of a Severance Advisory Council. The most interesting part of their exchange is when Cobel says, Mark S. is so close to completing Cold Harbor. I intend to finish the work that I started, which is why Milch must go. He's not equipped for the task. I must be floor manager. Recall that Cold Harbor was revealed to us as the name of Ms. Casey's file in a brief flash at the end of episode 1. It showed her vital signs and 5 bins at the bottom of the screen, just like the bins on the MDR screens. Each of them contained a percentage of completion and abbreviations for the 4 tempers, and the file says it's 68% done. Lumon is so desperate for Mark to complete this file that instead of firing him for the Macrodot rebellion like they did to the others, they gave him a 20% raise and urged him to come back. Then even after he committed another act of insubordination, not only did they keep him employed, but they even complied with his demands and brought back the rest of his team, pulling out all the stops for him. Drummond said in episode 2, the board will give Mark what he wants, including Heliar, because he won't finish without her. I'm convinced that they need Mark to complete Cold Harbor because he's refining the data on the chip in his own wife's brain, and only he can do it because of his unconscious emotional connection to her. As for why this particular project is of such importance to the company that they let him get away with all this and instituted all of these severance reforms, brought back his team, that's unclear. Check out my theory video on this topic for more on my theory of Gemma, Ms. Casey, and Lumon's endgame. But getting back to this scene, Helena says, I hear ego, hubris, arrogance. Here teaches us they only cause pain. This is more cult-like language. Helena has clearly been brainwashed all her life as well as Harmony. Cobel fires back, pointing out the nepotism behind Helena's position of power. She says, everything I accomplished, I earned through dedication and industry, not because I was born into it. Then, while Helena claims they didn't have to ask her back, Cobel says they didn't have a choice, because she knows they're aware of how dangerous she actually is, how diabolical. As Cobel said in episode 2, they don't value her, they fear her. Helena tells Cobel she'll take her to speak with the board, but when they approach the entrance to Lumon, a large, intimidating man is standing there, staring Cobel down. He looks like one of the Egan's goons, maybe a bodyguard, or even a hitman. I've seen theories that he is former Lumon CEO Bard Egan, somehow brought back from the dead, but I looked at this statue of Bard in the Perpetuity Wing from Season 1, and I just don't see enough of a resemblance to back this up, especially the ears. They don't match. So I think Harmony is merely threatened by this man's sinister appearance and must be aware about the violence of which Lumon is capable, so she retreats in fear and speeds off in her car. Let's not forget that in Season 1, Petey was running for his life from Lumon after getting reintegrated, terrified that they'd find him. And in the Lexington letter, penned by Ben Stiller, an innie warns her Audi to run because the company is coming after her, and then she conveniently gets in a fatal car accident. So they're quite capable of making a person disappear. It's heavily implied that Lumon caused that accident. And, after all, they certainly faked Gemma's death, kidnapped her, and are holding her prisoner now. Meanwhile, inside Lumon, Mark has started a search effort for Miss Casey, handing out flyers to the MDR team. Dylan is indifferent, claiming to be busy with his work, and we can assume he's just focused on earning the privilege of a visit with his Audi's wife. Now let's talk about the goat department. Mark and Helly, or is she Helena in disguise, take their flyers and return to the goat room from Season 1, going through the dark hallway again that represents the dark inner recesses of the human mind. They find the goat room empty, but they discover a crawl space, go on through it, and are stunned to find an enormous room full of rolling grass hills and goats, who have now matured from baby goats. A man wearing a giant black goat headdress appears beyond one of the hills, along with an imposing woman named Lorne, who brandishes a goat bell and says, "Are you here to kill me?" Why would she think they're here to kill her? Well, management clearly wants the departments to be afraid of each other, and with the creation of propaganda paintings like this, Lumon management is definitely the source of ridiculous rumors such as the violent coup that O&D supposedly waged against MDR, disempoweling people, which never actually happened, of course, as the characters figured out in Season 1. The O&D people were also led to believe that a violent coup was staged, but by MDR against their department, with another identical painting that just had the color of the badges switched so the victims are O&D. Another absurd rumor about MDR has been circulating too, but more on that and the reason for it all in a bit. Mark says they mean them no harm, and he introduces themselves to her, asking what this place is. Lauren says it's Mammalians Nurturable, a fancy way of just saying they take care of mammals, aka the goats. Mark shows her the Miss Casey flyer, telling her she was their former wellness director. Lauren says, "Wellness. We don't abide such fripperies here." More old-fashioned language, even more dated sounding than the rest of Lumon's language, actually. As Lauren says menacingly, "You should have left." It felt like a moment out of a horror movie or Deliverance after that line and based on the appearance of the people who show up. As the unwashed-looking, unkempt, creepy goat crew encircle them on all sides, boxing them in, Helly grabs a flyer and starts showing it to them, shoving it in their faces, asking if they've seen this woman. Lauren runs over to stop her and says she's sent a courier to tell Milch they're here. This seems like classic rebellious Helly behavior. Stay tuned till the end of this video for more thoughts on this section. When Mark says that they could kill Miss Casey if they find out that these people are looking for her. When Mark says that Lumon could kill Miss Casey if they find out they're looking for her, Lauren says that's not a mammalian's problem. But Mark makes a compelling argument. He says they just disappeared her. If we let this happen to Miss Casey, who's going to step up when it happens to us? This is a powerful message that calls to mind a famous poem by Martin Niemöller, First They Came. It reads, First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. This is the kind of message Mark is sending, that these people should stand up for Miss Casey, even though her plight doesn't affect them personally. Silence and inaction in the face of persecution means complicity, and if you stand by and do nothing, while other groups are targeted, who will be left to stand up for you when you need help? This message finally gets through to the goat crew, and Lorne admits that they had wellness sessions with Ms. Casey. The guy in the goat headdress said she told him his Audi excels at stargazing and it meant a great deal to him. And he actually looks emotional about it. Lorne says as far as they know she was retired, but they won't stand in the way of Mark's search. Now what exactly were they going to do to Mark and Helly if Mark hadn't won them over? I'm not sure about that. But that "you should have left" comment sure was menacing, as were the people boxing them in. Comically, they ask to see Mark and Helly's stomachs before they go, to verify that they don't have pouches. In Season 1, Bert said there was a rumor in O&D that the MDR crew had pouches with larval offspring, so apparently this rumor has spread even further. Again, I'm sure that management starts ridiculous rumors like this one, and like that O&D coup, just to alienate the departments, pit them against each other, and keep them from working together. A tactic of divide and conquer. It's classic. Governments around the world have utilized tactics like this for ages. Class warfare among the working classes, like these severed departments being pitted against each other. It's the perfect way for the elites, in this case Lumon, to keep control over them. As for all the goats, it's still unclear what they're doing here, but I would venture to say they're test subjects for Lumon's chips. Instead of testing them on lab rats, they're using goats, simply because the show's writers probably find them more quirky and whimsical. On the Severance podcast, the showrunners said that they didn't really have a specific plan for the goats when they wrote the goat room scene for Season 1. Meanwhile, Dylan is awarded an 18-minute visit with his Audi's wife. The security room has been transformed into an Audi visitation suite, as management now recognize that silly perks like finger traps will no longer be enough to motivate Dylan to do his work efficiently. Finding out he had a family was too much of a game changer. So Dylan gets to meet Gretchen, his Audi's wife, who is naturally bewildered by the fact that Ms. Wong is a child. I noticed Gretchen is dressed in a very old-fashioned manner, and they made her put her stuff in a sack, she said. So they're strictly regulating how much of his Audi's life Dylan is able to see and connect with. For instance, they allow her to tell him the names and ages of his 3 kids and show him a picture of their family. But the photo isn't a normal family photo. It's a photo of them in Western costumes in an amusement park. So it's not reflective of their actual lives outside Lumon. Let's not forget that Lumon doesn't want the innies to know or see too much about their outside lives. They even stagger their entrances and exits to work so they don't meet their co-workers as Audis. Frankly, then, I'm surprised they're allowing Dylan to meet his real wife at all and see a picture of his kids. But this must be a reflection of just how desperate Lumon is for Mark to finish the Cold Harbor file. Remember in episode 2, they decided to give Mark back his MDR crew because Drummond said Mark won't finish without them, and that includes Dylan. He needs all of them there. And he needs them to be functional. Dylan won't be productive anymore without a real incentive, now that he knows he has kids. So I'm pretty sure this visitation suite is just for his benefit, purely to keep him productive. I doubt that others on the severed floor will be given the same privilege. That's why Milch told Dylan to keep this information to himself. Gretchen refers to Milch as Seth, and Dylan asks who's Seth. And then Ms. Wong chillingly chimes in on a speaker saying, "Please refrain from sharing information that may be privileged or sensitive." She's closely monitoring their visit on video and listening in as well. And it's crazy how the innies aren't even allowed to know their bosses' first names or their own surnames. The information to which they can be exposed is strictly controlled here. Gretchen explains that Dylan's Audi had trouble keeping other jobs and just never quite found his thing, so that's why he got a severed job. This is a sad wake-up call for Dylan, who has always had fun imagining that he has a better life than that on the outside. It's also cruel to give him this glimpse of his life on the outside that he'll never get to experience firsthand. He seems to enjoy Gretchen hugging him, actually receiving physical affection. She says she loves him, but it's an awkward and sad moment because he doesn't really know her, and he's never gotten the chance to experience romantic love at all. As for Irving, he ventures off to O&D and visits Felicia. The two of them bond through their grief over Bert, tearfully hugging. Later, they also laugh and bond over happy memories of him. Any Bert's retirement is equivalent to his death, and this is actually how people deal with grief over loved ones passing. Irving shows her a booklet of pictures he drew of Bert, and a drawing of the testing floor hallway by accident, which he drew from memory after seeing the paintings made by his Audi. Felicia asks how he knows about the exports hall, saying O&D sent a lot of shipments there. They used to go themselves, but now management sends a guy to do it. He asks her if she remembers where it is, and the scene cuts right there, so we'll have to wait for that answer. Earlier in the episode, Irving had asked Dylan to go look for that area with him, thinking maybe this is what his weird dreams have been about with the black goo that we saw in Season 1. But Dylan wasn't interested. Again, he was focused on being productive so he could get his secret family visit. The question is, what were these shipments Felicia is talking about that O&D sent to this testing floor? Why did she call the hallway to the testing floor elevator the export hall? It leads to a sub-basement, but could there be an exit via that area too, perhaps? O&D probably makes a whole lot of other things besides paintings. We saw in Season 1 they were making watering cans, and oddly enough, we heard they were making hatchets. So who knows what else they could be making and sending to the testing floor? Probably equipment to use on the test subjects down there like Ms. Casey. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. But moving on. Meanwhile, Milch shows up for work and looks angry to find Mark had abandoned his balloons in the hallway. He had thought Mark was still childish enough to be pacified by the balloons, apparently. Then he enters his office to find Natalie with the board on speaker. She speaks in her usual bizarre, old-fashioned vernacular. The board is jubilant at your ascendance. It wants you to feel appreciated and asks if you do. The board austerely desires for you to feel connected to Lumon's history. And then she continues, please accept from the board these inclusively recanonicalized paintings intended to help you see yourself in Keir, our founder. He receives 3 well-known paintings of Keir, but essentially reimagined in blackface. Keir's portrait, his convalescence as a sick child, and his stance on a mountaintop. Milch, devoted company man though he is, and seemingly a true believer in the cult of Keir, looks stunned and dismayed by what he's seeing. Meanwhile, throughout this scene, Natalie communicates an enormous amount with just her eyes and pursed lips, staring at him as if to express empathy, as another person of color who has had to experience this racism. She states that the board wishes to express that she received the same gift when she received her current position and found it extremely moving. Notice the wording there. The board wants her to say that, and she phrases it just that way. She doesn't say, I received the same gift and found it extremely moving. She says the board wishes for her to express this. Meanwhile, she's staring at Milch with anger and pain in her eyes. Then she puts her creepy fake smile back on and leaves. I'm sure she found her own gift and his gift as offensive as he did, but Lumon is always listening and they aren't allowed to express any dissent. So now we're getting a glimpse into another dark side of Lumon, what it's like to be a person of color working there, and the racism of this Keir culture. Back in Audi land, Devin comes home to find the unsettling presence of Natalie talking to Ricken, flattering him about his book and stroking his fragile ego. Natalie explains that Ricken's book found its way onto the severed floor. Devon questions how that happened, clearly suspicious, and we know from Season 1 that Cobel stole it. Severed workers can't bring items with text in or out of work, so she's right to be suspicious. Natalie has roped Ricken into writing a special version of the you are specifically for innies, saying his words have had a profound effect on their workers, and there's a certain verbiage to which innies respond more favorably if they just tweak it a bit. Basically, Ricken is a messiah figure to the innies. He's their idol. Since Lumon recognizes that his book radicalized them, they want to take advantage of it and twist it in their favor. They clearly want to take back control of the narrative by commissioning Ricken to write a new version, probably a whole new handbook for them. And it's fitting because their old handbook was so harsh and written in biblical-sounding language, so it's like their Old Testament, with Keir seeming like a vengeful god, while Ricken's version will probably be like a New Testament version with Keir as a more forgiving god. This will be in keeping with the gentler way that Lumon is treating the innies now. No more psychological torture in the break room, more perks, and more freedom, or the illusion of freedom anyway. And this new painting, Keir pardons his betrayers, that's Keir forgiving the sins of the MDR team, just as Jesus represents forgiveness of humanity's sins in the New Testament of the Bible. In Season 1, Episode 1, Milch showed Mark a copy of the Keir Chronicle with an article, clearly fabricated, of course, stating that the MDR team were being celebrated as heroes. And at that event, fictional, of course, it said Ricken delivered the benediction, and he was the author of The You Are and These Values 9, How I Let Keir In. At the time, I couldn't imagine Ricken actually writing a book like that as a Keir convert, since he was so firmly against Severance in Season 1. But his ego is so fragile that all it took was some flattery from Natalie, and it appears he really will write that book now. Thus, Lumon is such a diabolical puppet master that it had that newspaper created before they'd even convinced Ricken to come into the fold of Keir. Anyway, after Devon leaves Ricken and Natalie alone, she tells Mark what's going on with them. She and Mark have hatched a plan to send his innie a message by burning it into his retinas. He had timed how fast he can run into work and how long the elevator ride takes him in this episode. They glue felt letters onto a UV light that reads, "Who is alive?" and Mark plans to stare at it so the words are imprinted on his retinas, then try to run into work fast enough that his innie will still be able to see the message after he transitions. They want to find out for sure if his innie meant that Gemma is alive at the party. Oh, and Devon hasn't told Ricken about their plan, saying it would be insane to tell him. Why is she even married to him again? She and Mark literally laugh and crack jokes about how ridiculous he is. At any rate, Mark tests out the plan in his car that night and is startled to open his eyes and see Ragabi standing in front of that car. She demands that he let her in the car and tells him his plan won't work. He could blind himself, and his innie wouldn't be able to respond to his message anyway. She heard about the OTC, and she asks him if his innie told Devon that Gemma is alive at Lumon. Mark is stunned and asks if she is alive, and Ragabi says, "She was the last time I saw her." So this is pretty much confirmation that Lumon faked Gemma's death. She's not a robot nor a clone. She's still alive, just probably brain damaged and altered by the chip they put in her brain. For more on my theory about this, again, check out my video on Gemma and Lumon's endgame. Ragabi says the only way to get information out of Lumon is reintegration, and that she's better at it now. She says, "I can sew together a version of you that loves her with a version that can," and there he cuts her off and says, "Do it. I want to see my wife." I'm pretty sure the rest of her sentence would have been, "a version that can find her and try to get her out of Lumon." So they get right to work on reintegrating Mark in his basement, as he wears his red sweater that signifies his outie status. She asks him a series of questions that start easy and become more complex. As his severed brainwaves get closer and closer together, he starts to have difficulty answering the questions, and he starts glitching back and forth. With brilliant camera work and CGI, we get a mind-bending sequence of images as Mark glitches between his dual selves, back and forth. And finally, Ragabi asks for his first memory, and we see that it's his first memory as an innie, laying on the conference room table with Petey's voice asking him, "Who are you?" Just like what happened to Helly in the premiere of Season 1. So the reintegration process is already starting to work, and as he progresses through it, he'll probably start glitching in and out between innie and outie much more frequently, more and more. Just like what happened to Petey in Season 1, but hopefully with a better result. And eventually, he'll be able to get information in and out of Lumon that way. This is going to be key for him uncovering the truth about Gemma and trying to get her out. Elsewhere, we get a glimpse into Dylan's life as Gretchen goes off to work, her third shift job, and he lounges on the couch reading a magazine. He seems detached as he's not paying attention to his 3 kids, as 2 of them play and one sits in front of the TV as usual, just like the last time we saw him in Season 1. Dylan seems depressed, probably due to his failure to support his family that drove him to take a severed job. He couldn't even remember to slice up a roll of cookie dough to put in the oven without his wife reminding him in this scene. They talk awkwardly about her visit with his innie after he asks, and she doesn't seem to want to discuss it when he brings it up. She may find she takes more of a liking to innie Dylan than outie Dylan this season. Also, I have to point out that there appears to be a Kier doll on the floor near the couch. The Kier cult must be a powerful thing in society, at the very least in this town of Kier where they live, for them to actually have a Kier doll for their kids. My co-host Scarlet Echoes noticed this on our live stream. Okay, now I'm going to give you a little spoiler alert. I'm going to address a revelation from episode 4 of Severance, Woe's Hollow. If you haven't watched Woe's Hollow yet, that's episode 4, come back to this part later. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room right now. Helly isn't really Helly. As episode 4 revealed, Helena is serving as a mole for Lumon, quite convincingly. In episode 3, she recognizes that Irving must be missing Bert, and he's hesitant to take a flyer to O&D, so she feigns concern, saying, "We've got you." She actually acts more sensitive to his feelings than Mark is in that scene. She also questions whether they'll really let them roam around, and Mark reminds her that the training video said they can go wherever they want now, mentioning the catchphrase, "Lumon is listening." Dylan smartly points out that he thought that meant they're listening to their conversations, and Irving agrees, saying he got the hint of a double meaning. I pointed this out too in my episode 1 breakdown. Lumon is definitely literally listening in for sure. Their instincts are correct here, but what they don't know is that Helena is the one listening to their conversations, a human microphone, not a real one. On the way to the goat room, Helena wants to know what Mark's plan is if they find Ms. Casey. He says they'd get her to the south stairwell, he'll go with her, and once they're out the door, his outie will know what to do. So Helena's pumping him for information to report back to the board here. He asks if she's sure she's okay with helping him find Miss Casey, and she says she is. Then they have an extremely awkward moment where they almost kiss. But honestly, the awkwardness is mostly on Mark's side. Helena looks ready for it, like she actually wants this, and she's more comfortable with it because she's an outie. But Mark is nervous and bashful like an adolescent kid, because his innie is like an adolescent who doesn't have experience with this. So he chickens out and backs off. When they're in the goat field area, Helena is effective again at playing the role of Helly, acting fearless and defiant, like when she grabs a Miss Casey flyer and shows it to the goat crew workers, even as they have her and Mark surrounded and they all look terrifying. She really sells the role, acting as if she actually wants to help Mark find his outie's wife. I'll get into more on the Helena reveal in my episode 4 deep dive. But right now I want to know what you think. Why do you think Cobel panicked and backed off from Helena, and what will be her next move? What the hell is up with the goat field and the weird goat people? What are your theories on the testing floor and Felicia's statement that the hallway to that elevator is the export hall? How will Mark's reintegration change the game? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments.